The sound of the door slamming echoed through the cold marble hall, a final sentence that decreed once more the failure of Marcos Silveira. From the top of the staircase, the double and incessant crying of his 8-month-old sons seemed to mock his fortune, his power, all the empire that he commanded with a firm fist. It was the 12th nanny in just 3 months. The woman, with deep dark circles and shoulders slumped from exhaustion, could barely face him as she said her last words. "I give up, Mr. Silveira. This crying isn't normal. They don't stop ever." Marcos felt a wave of fury and humiliation. He, who solved multi-million-dollar problems before lunch, was incapable of silencing his own children. Inside him, a cruel voice whispered the truth that he would never admit out loud. The fault was not the nannies. While the housekeeper, Carmen, a lady who had worked for the family even before Isabella, his late wife, led the next candidate through the service area, the sound of the twins crying seemed to pass through the walls. Helena Silva, a 28-year-old woman with a serene gaze and hands calloused from knowing hard work, was there for the maid position. But upon hearing that sharp and desperate wail, something inside her moved. Carmen sighed, expecting a complaint or a discouraged comment, but Helena just stopped and tilted her head, listening with a different kind of attention. "Excuse me, Donna Carmen," she said, her voice low but firm. "I know I came for something else, but that crying, it sounds like a cry of sadness, of a very deep sadness. May I see them?" Carmen looked at Helena, a mixture of astonishment and weariness stamped on her face. In 3 months, she had interviewed women with impeccable resumes, educators, pediatric nurses, all promising magical solutions for the twins crying, and all had failed miserably. Now, this candidate for general services, with her simplicity and unexpected boldness, claimed to understand the nature of that sound that had become the mansion's soundtrack. The protocol was clear. No one without Marcos's express authorization could approach the children, but desperation was a powerful counselor. Carmen saw in Helena's eyes not the arrogance of one who has an answer, but the compassion of one who feels another's pain. Perhaps that was the difference. "Their room is at the end of the hall," Carmen said, her voice low, almost conspiratorial, breaking her own rules. "But Mr. Silveira doesn't. Like strangers?" She didn't complete the sentence. The truth was that Marcos didn't like anyone getting close. With the sigh of someone betting their last chip, she made a gesture. "Come, but be quick. Just look." Upon entering the baby's room, the impact was immediate, and not because of the crying, which now seemed like background noise to what Helena truly felt. The environment was cold, impersonal, more like a luxury hospital room than a nest of love. The cribs, extremely expensive, were identical and positioned symmetrically. The toys, imported and educational, were perfectly organized on the shelves, untouched. There was not a single portrait on the wall, a mobile with a soft song, a scent of childhood. It was a room that screamed absence. Helena approached slowly, and what she saw broke her heart. The 2 boys, Pedro and Paulo, were not writhing from colic or hunger. They were lying down, their small bodies tense, and their eyes filled with an anguish that did not belong to. Babies were fixed on a single point, the white, empty wall that separated their room from the one next door. They were not crying for the world. They were crying for that wall, as if desperately calling for someone they knew, somehow, should be there. Helena left the room in silence, but her mind was in a whirlwind. The image of those babies, so small and already carrying the weight of an invisible pain, would not leave her. She followed Carmen back to the kitchen, her heart heavy. The housekeeper seemed ready to dismiss her, to say the experiment was over, but Helena interrupted her with a gentleness that commanded respect. "Donna Carmen, just one more thing," she began, her voice low. "That room, the one next to theirs, why is its door always closed? And why aren't there any pictures of the children's mother anywhere in the house?" The questions hung in the air, direct and perceptive. Carmen flinched, caught by surprise. None of the other candidates had dared to touch on such intimate matters. The housekeeper, who had seen that house flourish with Isabella's love and now saw it wither under the fog of Marcos's grief, felt a pang of loyalty and fear. "Those are Mr. Silvera's orders," she answered evasively. "Since the accident, he doesn't allow any talk of Mrs. Isabella. That was her room. It has been locked ever since." Far from there, in the sumptuous office at the other end of the mansion, Marcos Silvera tried in vain to concentrate on the numbers of a merger contract, but the charts and clauses dissolved before his eyes, replaced by the sound he so hated. Every cry from Pedro or Paulo was like a needle piercing the wound he refused to let heal. For him, that sound was not just a nuisance. It was the voice of the nightmare itself. It was the sound that reminded him of the deafening silence of the hospital room, of Isabella's last weak smile, of the promise she made him that they would be a happy family. He remembered the smell of antiseptic, mixed with her perfume, of her hand growing cold in his. In his mind, distorted by pain, the children were not the legacy of his great love, but the price he paid for it. They were the living and noisy reminder that to have them, he had to lose her. That was why he distanced himself, why he locked himself away, believing that physical distance could somehow numb the torture in his soul. Carmen's revelation was like the final piece of a terribly sad puzzle. Everything fell into place in Helena's mind. The cold house, the absent father, the locked room, the babies crying for a wall. It was not a coincidence. It was the very geography of pain. At that moment, the maid position became secondary. A greater force, a sense of mission, took hold of her. She looked at Carmen, and her voice, once just serene, now carried the weight of an unshakable conviction. "Donna Carmen, I want the job, but you need to understand. I will clean every corner of this house, but my real task will be to take care of its soul. Give me a chance, not to be a nanny, but to try to heal this place. I will not promise silence. I will promise that I will do everything so that Pedro and Paulo can feel again that this is a home." The housekeeper, who for months had only obeyed orders and witnessed the decline of that family, saw in Helena the first spark of real hope. In an act of insubordination born from the deepest loyalty, she decided, "The job is yours, Helena. Do what needs to be done. I will make sure Mr. Silvera doesn't bother you for now." Helena's first days in the mansion were a silent revolution. She did not run to the children's room with bottles or rattles like her predecessors. Instead, her first act was to open the heavy curtains in the living room, allowing the sunlight, a long exiled element, to flood the marble and warm the environment. While dusting the furniture, she hummed old lullabies, simple melodies her grandmother had taught her, and her soft voice seemed to weave a layer of warmth over the house's oppressive silence. She would pass by the twins' room corridor, and even with the persistent crying, she would speak to the closed door in a loving and constant tone. "I am here, little ones. Your mommy loved you very much, and her love is still here. You will see." They were small, almost invisible gestures, but they represented a fundamental change. Helena was not trying to silence the crying. She was trying to answer it, filling the house's void, not with techniques, but with the constant and affirmative presence of affection. A few days passed, and Carmen became an attentive observer of that silent revolution. At first, her heart filled with dread with every curtain Helena opened, with every song she hummed, expecting at any moment Marcos's fury to crash down upon them. But the fury did not come. In its place, something different began to settle in. The housekeeper, whose shoulders carried years of sadness and loyalty, began to notice she was breathing a little deeper. The sunlight, which once seemed an affront to the house's grief, now seemed to purify it. The soft melody that floated through the corridors was not a celebration, but a comfort to the house itself. One afternoon, Carmen found a small vase with field daisies picked from the backyard garden on a small table in the hallway. Such a simple, lively gesture, so Isabella. At that moment, Carmen's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of an overwhelming gratitude. She looked for Helena in the kitchen and, without saying a word, placed a cup of hot tea in her hands, a pact of complicity and hope, sealed in silence. At the end of that same week, Marcos left his office later than usual, his mind heavy with work and his body exhausted by the pain that never left him. As he crossed the grand hall to go up to his quarters, he stopped. There was something different, an almost imperceptible disturbance in the stagnant atmosphere of his sanctuary of grief. He couldn't identify what it was at first. Was it the way the moonlight entered through the window, now without the filter of the heavy curtain, or a very subtle smell of flowers and fresh air that overlaid the scent of dust and stopped time? He frowned, a feeling of strangeness invading him. That house was his cocoon, a place where every object, every shadow, was a reflection of his loss. Any alteration, however small, felt like a violation. He looked around, searching for the source of that dissonance, but saw nothing out of place. Irritated with the feeling he could not name, he went up the stairs, not realizing that this small disturbance was the first sign that the ice around his heart was beginning, millimetrically, to crack. A week passed, and with Carmen's silent complicity, Helena felt it was time to take the next step. One afternoon, while Marcos was locked in one of his long video meetings, she entered the twins' room. The crying, as always, was the only greeting. But this time, Helena did not stay at the door. She walked slowly to the center of the room and sat on the soft rug, exactly between the two cribs. She did not try to pick them up, did not offer a toy, did not make any sound to muffle their wail. She just stayed there, a calm and solid presence in the midst of the storm of sadness. "I am here with you, little angels," she whispered, her voice so soft it could barely be heard over the crying. "You can cry all you need to. I'm not going anywhere." And she kept her word. The hours passed. The afternoon sun gave way to the twilight shadows, and Helena remained motionless. Gradually, a subtle change occurred. The crying, once sharp and desperate, began to have pauses, as if the small lungs were testing the air, surprised to find a presence that did not try to silence them, but that seemed to understand them. It was during this long vigil that Helena had the final confirmation, the irrefutable proof of her theory. In each new wave of crying, she observed the same haunting pattern. Pedro and Paulo, each in his crib, would turn their little heads in a perfect and painful synchrony, their little eyes fixed on the same exact spot on the white wall. It was not a spasm or a random movement. It was a direction, a plea, a mute supplication for what or who was on the other side of that masonry. Helena felt a shiver run down her spine. It was as if she could see their pain, an invisible energy that projected itself toward Isabella's sealed room. They did not just miss a lap or a generic affection. They felt the specific absence of their mother and somehow the rejection of their father, both pains concentrated in that forbidden room. In that instant, Helena knew, with a clarity that cut to the soul, that no lullaby or warm bottle would solve it. The cure for that family was not in the future. It was locked behind that door. With the truth burning in her chest, Helena now faced a much bigger obstacle than the baby's crying: Marcos. Silvera himself. How could she, a new hire, a stranger, approach that man encapsulated in his pain and tell him that the key to his home's peace was at the epicenter of his suffering? The fear was paralyzing. She imagined the summary dismissal, the humiliation, his fury at seeing her touch his most sacred wound. That night, in the quiet of the kitchen, she confided part of her anguish to Carmen, who listened with a worried expression. "I am sure, Donna Carmen, the answer is in that room. As long as that door is closed, this house will have no peace." The housekeeper, who knew the depth of Marcos's love and pain, shook her head, her eyes full of a somber warning. "Be careful, my child. That is not just a room. It is his sanctuary. the place where time stopped. He forbade anyone from getting near. Talking about Mrs. Isabella is already a risk, but trying to open that door, he could destroy you. For him, the love he felt for her was his life, and that room is all that's left. The opportunity, or rather the necessity, arose 3 nights later, amidst a crisis that surpassed all previous ones. Pedro and Paulo's crying reached a new level of desperation, a sharp and continuous wail that seemed to make the mansion's windows tremble. It was an unbearable sound, the materialization of all the anguish accumulated within those walls. Suddenly, Marcos's office door burst open with a bang. He appeared in the hallway, not as the controlled businessman, but as a man on the edge of his sanity. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands were trembling. He didn't yell at the babies. His fury turned to Carmen, who appeared frightened at the top of the stairs. "For God's sake, Carmen, make it stop!" he bellowed, his voice hoarse with agony. "I can't take it anymore. Hire 20 nannies. Pay double, triple. I'll give everything I have, but I need silence." In that instant, seeing the raw, naked pain instead of arrogance, Helena felt compassion overcome fear. He was a victim too, and it was then that she stepped forward out of the kitchen's shadows, her heart beating uncontrollably against her ribs. "Mr. Silvera," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the tense air. "Money cannot silence this crying." The silence that followed Helena's words was heavier and denser than any scream. Marcos turned slowly, his gaze, once lost in agony, now focused on her with an icy intensity. Fury replaced the pain on his face, transforming it into a mask of contempt and wounded power. "And who are you?" he hissed, each word as sharp as a shard of glass. "The cleaning lady, hired 2 weeks ago, and you dare to lecture me about my children and my pain?" He took a step toward her, his posture imposing, designed to intimidate, to crush. Carmen in the background held her breath, her face pale with terror, ready to intervene and sacrifice herself to save Helena from the storm she herself had provoked. But Helena did not back down. She held his gaze, and in her eyes there was no defiance, only a deep and sad compassion. "I am someone who is not afraid to hear what they are screaming, Mr. Silvera," she replied, her voice remaining steady. "And they are not asking for a new nanny. They are calling for their father. They are calling for you." The implicit accusation in her words that he was an absent father hit Marcos like a punch to the gut, leaving him momentarily without air and without words. It was the opening Helena needed. She continued, her voice now softer, but charged with an urgency that could not be ignored. "Please listen to me. For days I have watched Pedro and Paulo. Their crying is not from hunger, not from colic, not from anything a nanny can fix. It is a cry of absence. Have you noticed where they look all the time? At the wall of the room next door. They look at their mother's room." She paused, gathering all the courage she possessed for the final thrust. "With all due respect, sir, their pain is a reflection of yours. They feel your rejection. To heal them, you need to start healing yourself. And the cure, the peace of this house, the love your children so desperately need, all of it is locked in that room. You need to open that door, not for me, for them, and for her memory." Helena's words hung in the air, and the universe of the mansion seemed to contract into an absolute silence, where only the heartbeats of 3 people and the distant crying of the twins existed. The fury on Marcos's face dissolved, giving way not to calm, but to something much more frightening, a raw vulnerability, a visible collapse of all the barriers he had built around himself. Every syllable Helena uttered was a hammer against the wall of his denial. The image of his sons looking at the wall, the idea of their crying being an echo of his own pain. It was a truth so monstrous, and at the same time so perfectly logical, that it ungrounded him. The part of him that was the ruthless businessman wanted to scream, to humiliate her, to expel her for her insolence. But the part that was still Isabella's husband, the part that remembered the promises made and the love he felt, was subdued. For the first time since the tragedy, He did not hear his children's crying as an accusation, but as the desperate question Helena had identified. After what felt like an eternity, Marcos lowered his eyes. His shoulders, normally straight and imposing, slumped in a gesture of overwhelming defeat. He said not a word. To Helena, he did not acknowledge her, did not validate her. His pride would not allow it. Instead, he turned and, like an automaton, began to walk, not toward the stairs to his room, but toward the dark and dusty corridor that led to the forbidden wing of the house. His steps were slow, dragging, the sound of a man walking to his own execution or to his salvation. Helena and Carmen followed him with their eyes, not daring to breathe. Stopping in front of the white oak door of Isabella's room, he held out his hand to Carmen, palm open, without looking at her. The request was mute but unequivocal. The housekeeper, with her heart in her throat, ran to a small closet in the hallway, took a solitary key from a hidden hook, and placed it in Marcos's trembling hand. There he stood, the man who controlled empires, trembling before a simple closed door. The sound of the key turning in the lock was obscenely loud in the house's silence, a metallic creak that seemed to tear the fabric of time. The door opened with a long, drawn-out groan, revealing the contained darkness. As Marcos took the first step inside, a scent hit him with the force of a punch. It was not the smell of mold or dust, but her perfume. Gardenias and vanilla, the unmistakable aroma of Isabella, which had been trapped there, hovering in the air like a ghost. His eyes, adjusting to the gloom, began to register the scene. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The double bed made with the bedspread she loved. The book she was halfway through reading on the nightstand, with her glasses resting on the cover, her shoes beside the bed, as if she had just taken them off. On a rocking chair in the corner, a small pile of baby clothes, bought weeks before the birth, waited uselessly for their owners. It was not an abandoned room. It was a shrine to an interrupted life, and every object was a silent witness to the happiness that had been stolen from him. He walked to the middle of the room, his body moving with a rigidity that betrayed the superhuman effort he was making not to break down. He reached out and touched the silk cover of the pillow, and it was as if a dam broke inside him. The memories, which he had locked away with the same ferocity with which he had locked that door, came in an uncontrollable avalanche. He saw her laughing on that bed as they chose the names, saw the morning sunlight on her face as she talked about what their first walk in the park would be like, felt the warmth of her hand in his as she promised they would overcome anything together. The pain, once a constant dull ember, exploded into a fire that consumed him whole. His knees gave way. Marcos Silveira, the man of steel, fell to the floor, his face buried in his hands, and a sob tore through his throat, a primitive, guttural sound of pure agony. It was the cry of a man who had lost not only his wife, but himself. Outside, Helena closed her eyes, her heart aching in solidarity. That was the sound of the wound, finally being opened so it could heal. The sound of Marcos's weeping seemed to fill every millimeter of the room, a wave of pain finally finding its voice. Helena remained at the door, her heart heavy, giving the man the space he needed to break completely, knowing it was the only way he could one day rebuild himself. After long minutes, when the violent sobs began to subside, turning into a low, exhausted moan, she felt it was time. With a look, she signaled for Carmen, who was crying silently. Beside her, to check on the babies in the other room, Helena had an intuition that the father's emotional earthquake might have been felt in some way by his sons. Then, with light steps, she entered Isabella's sanctuary. Her eyes did not seek to comfort the man on the floor, not yet. They scanned the room, searching for a sign, a message, something a mother's love would not leave behind. And then she saw it. On the dark wood dresser, there was a marquetry box, elegant and sober, that seemed to have been placed there with a purpose. It was not just any jewelry box. It had an air of importance, of something left to be found. Moved by a force she did not understand, Helena approached the box. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the smooth, cold wood. She looked at Marcos, a huddled figure of pain on the rug, and knew that whatever was inside was for him. With almost reverent care, she lifted the lid. What she found inside made her heart stop for a moment. It was not jewelry or material keepsakes. It was letters, dozens of white envelopes tied with a sky-blue satin ribbon. On top of the main pile, Isabella's elegant, rounded handwriting was unmistakable. It was written, "To my love, Marcos, for when the longing hurts more than you think you can bear." And just below, there were two smaller packets of envelopes. One said, "For my Pedro," and the other, "For my Paolo." Helena gasped. It was not a will. It was an inheritance of love. Isabella's presence was alive in those words. Her heart pounding, she took the first letter from Marcos's stack, approached the broken man on the floor, and gently touched his shoulder. "Sir," she whispered, "I think your wife left something for you." Marcos lifted his face from the floor, his swollen red eyes meeting the extended letter in Helena's hand. The handwriting, that handwriting he knew like the back of his hand, that had filled love notes, shopping lists, plans for the future. Seeing it there, on an envelope he had never seen before, was like seeing a ghost. With a hand that trembled uncontrollably, he took the letter. The paper was thick, high quality, and the simple touch seemed to carry her energy. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at his own name written by his wife's hand, fearing what he would find inside. Had she foreseen her own death? Would it be a farewell he could not bear to read? Fear battled with the desperate need to hear her voice one more time. With a shaky breath that was almost a prayer, he tore open the envelope. The faint scent of gardenias was released from the paper, and for an instant it was as if Isabella were there, whispering for him to have courage. His eyes passed over the first words, and his entire body shuddered. The letter did not begin with a farewell, but with a celebration. "My eternal love," the beginning read. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to hold you. But before sadness overwhelms you, I need you to know something. With all the clarity of the universe, I was, am, and always will be the happiest woman in the world for having carried our children." Marcos's eyes widened, tears welling up again, but this time for a different reason. The letter continued, each word dismantling the fortress of his pain and guilt. "I know the size of your heart, Marcos. I know your love for me is so immense that it risks turning into a guilt that is not yours. Please, my love, do not do this. Do not blame yourself. And, above all else in the world, never, under any circumstances, blame our boys. They did not take me from you. They are the purest and most beautiful part of us. They are the proof that our love was real and strong enough to create life. Choosing them, bringing them into the world, was the most right and happy decision of my entire life. Now, you must live for the three of us. Love them for me, love them for you. Sing to them, tell them about me. Let them feel the wonderful father you are. This is my one and final request." The letter trembled in Marcos's hands. He read it once, twice, 3 times. Each reading was like a balm, a wave of warmth that dissolved the ice that had formed around his heart for almost a year. Isabella's words were not an accusation. They were a liberation. It was the permission that he, in his arrogance and pain, never knew how to give himself. Permission to grieve her loss without contaminating the legacy of love they had created. Permission to be a father. The crushing weight of guilt, which he carried like armor, simply disintegrated, leaving behind only the clean, honest pain of longing. For the first time, he did not feel like a guilty party, but a widower, a man who loved and was deeply loved. He raised his eyes and looked at Helena. The anger, the contempt, everything had vanished. In its place, there was a gratitude so immense and overwhelming that he had no words to express it. In that instant, the crying of the twins coming from the other room reached his ears in a completely new way. It was no longer the sound of his tragedy, it was the sound of Isabella's children, and they were calling him. With a determination born from the ashes of his pain, Marcos stood up. His legs were still weak, his body exhausted by the emotional convulsion, but his purpose was clear. He folded the letter with infinite care, put it in his jacket pocket, close to his heart, and walked out of Isabella's room. He passed by Helena and Carmen, who watched him with a mixture of astonishment and relief, and did not stop. His feet took him directly to the nursery door, the place he had avoided like the plague. He stopped for a second on the threshold, the fear of the unknown, the fear of his own inadequacy, threatening to paralyze him. But then Isabella's words echoed in his mind, "Love them for both of us." He pushed the door open and went in. His eyes went to Pedro's crib, who was crying with a red face and small clenched fists. Ignoring the tremor in his own hands, Marcos leaned over the crib and, for the first time in 8 long and painful months, he reached out and picked up his son. Pedro's body was tense and rigid in Marcos's clumsy arms. The crying continued for a second, out of reflex, but then something changed. The baby, who in his short life had only known the hurried and impersonal touch of nannies, suddenly felt something different. A warmth, a firmness, a scent that was vaguely familiar, engraved in his DNA. The crying stopped. It did not diminish, did not turn into a whimper. It simply ceased. The silence that fell was so abrupt and so profound that it seemed louder than the noise before. Pedro, his little face still wet with tears, snuggled instinctively against his father's chest, his small body relaxing completely. Marcos looked down at the son, who now stared at him with large, curious eyes, and felt a wave of love so overwhelming, so fierce, that it left him breathless. It was a pure feeling, stripped of guilt and pain, that filled him entirely. At the door, Helena and Carmen watched the scene. The tears now streaming down their faces were no longer of fear or sadness, but of the purest and most redeeming joy. While Marcos was paralyzed by that miracle, Paulo's crying in the other crib continued, now seeming lonely and even more desperate in the newfound silence. The sound hit Marcos no longer as an irritation, but as an urgent call, and his heart broke with the weight of months of neglect. He looked from Pedro, safe in his arms, to Paulo, helpless in his crib, and knew he could not choose. Moved by a paternal instinct that had just been born, he walked to the rocking chair that had remained untouched in the corner of the room. With infinite care, he sat down, adjusting Pedro in one arm. Then he leaned over and with his free arm picked up Paulo. The second baby, upon feeling the same contact, the same warmth, also fell silent at the same instant. And there, Marcos Silveira remained, the man who fled from his children for 8 months, sitting in the dark, holding both against his chest. For the first time, the twins' room was not filled with crying, but with the soft sound of the breathing of a family that was, finally, beginning to find itself. That night marked a boundary in time, a watershed moment in the history of that family. Marcos did not leave the rocking chair. The hours passed, dawn arrived, and he remained there, rocking his children, feeling their weight and warmth like an anchor bringing him back to life. He studied every detail of their faces under the soft lamplight. Pedro's little nose, identical to Isabella's. The way Paulo's lips curved into a half-smile as he slept. He whispered to them, his voice hoarse with emotion and long, suppressed weeping. He asked for forgiveness 1,000,000 times, not for them to understand the words, but for them to feel the vibration of regret and love in his chest. At dawn, Carmen tiptoed into the room and found him asleep, his head tilted to the side, still with both babies sleeping peacefully in his lap. The image was so powerful, so redemptive, that the housekeeper had to lean against the doorframe. Later, when Marcos finally woke up with an aching body, his first act was not to call his office. He looked at Helena with a humility she had never imagined seeing in him and asked, "Where do I start? Teach me, please." The days that followed were a metamorphosis witnessed by everyone in the mansion. Marcos Silveira, the business titan who never took vacations, began to cancel meetings. He delegated multi-million-dollar projects with a tranquility that perplexed his partners. His cell phone screen, once dominated by stock market charts, now displayed videos on how to prepare fruit purees and the ideal temperature for a baby's bath. The sepulchral silence of the house was replaced by new and strange sounds. Marcos's clumsy laughter when he got the amount of formula powder wrong, his off-key attempts to hum a lullaby that Helena had taught him, saying it was Isabella's favorite. He learned to change diapers, to decipher the different types of whimpers, to give a bath without getting soap in their little eyes. Each small task was a challenge, but also a victory. One more step away from the man he was, and closer to the father Isabella knew he could be. Helena watched from a respectful distance, intervening only when requested, serving not as a nanny, but as the guardian of Isabella's memory, gently, guiding him on the path she would have walked with him. The weeks turned into months, and the Silveira mansion became unrecognizable, not because of the decor, but because of the life that now pulsed through its corridors. The twins' desperate crying was replaced by a new language, curious babbling, shrieks of joy, contagious laughter. Pedro and Paulo flourished under their father's attentive care. Their eyes, once dull with sadness, now shone with curiosity and confidence. They followed Marcos's every move around the room, their little faces lighting up in toothless smiles whenever he approached. One afternoon, while Marcos was lying on the living room rug, making funny faces and noises, something magical happened. Pedro, watching his father's performance, let out his first laugh. A pure, crystal-clear sound full of happiness which echoed through the room and hit Marcos straight in the heart. In that instant, he felt a joy so intense and visceral that it surpassed any professional success he had ever had. He looked at his sons, no longer as the memory of a loss, but as the most vibrant and wonderful proof of his existence. They were his boys. Marcos's healing process was not limited to the hours he spent with his sons. Every night after putting Pedro and Paulo to sleep, lulled by his now steady voice singing Isabella's song, he maintained a sacred ritual. He would go to her room, which was no longer a mausoleum of pain but a haven of peace, and sit in the rocking chair. He would open the marquetry box and read a letter. Sometimes he read one of those meant for him, drinking in his wife's memories and encouragement. On other nights, he would take one of the letters addressed to one of the boys and read it aloud to the walls of the silent room, as if he were reporting back to Isabella. Pedro laughed for the first time today, my love. He would whisper to the void, "You should have seen it. He has your laugh, and Paulo is already trying to crawl, stubborn as ever." It was his way of keeping her present, of sharing with her the joys and challenges of the journey they should have taken together. It was no longer a dialogue with pain, but a conversation with eternal love. Time, which once dragged on in a procession of grey, identical days, now rushed by, driven by a new routine of discoveries and joys. Soon the calendar marked a date that for Marcos was a lump in his throat. Pedro and Paulo's first birthday. The date, however, was a double-edged sword, as it was also the day that would mark 1 year since Isabella's death. The ghost of old pain threatened to resurface, and the fear of not being able to reconcile the celebration of life with the grief of loss haunted him for days. One night, while watching Helena fold the boys' little clothes, he confessed his anguish. "I don't know how to do this, Helena. How can I celebrate the happiest day of their lives, which was the saddest day of mine?" Helena stopped what she was doing and looked at him with the serenity that had become the pillar of that house. "Perhaps you could try to see it another way," she said softly. "It is not the day you lost her. It is the day that she, in her last act of love, gave you the 2 greatest gifts of your life. Celebrating their birthday is the most beautiful way to honor her memory and her choice." Helena's words acted as a beacon, guiding Marcos out of the darkness of doubt. He decided that his son's birthday would not be a day of mourning, but the greatest celebration of love that house had ever seen. And for the first time, he did not delegate the task. He dived headfirst into the preparations, to the astonishment of Carmen, who was used to just receiving orders and a check. Marcos chose the theme, the balloon colors, tasted 3 different types of cake, and spent an entire afternoon with Helena setting up a small play area in the garden. The mansion, once a silent mausoleum, transformed into a whirlwind of activity and joy. There were colorful balloons in the hallways, the sweet smell of cake baking in the oven, and most importantly, the constant sound of the twins' laughter as they happily crawled amidst the mess, amazed by every ribbon and every decoration. Marcos, seeing the genuine joy in his children's eyes, felt the last shadow of pain dissipate, giving way to an immense and serene gratitude. The birthday dawned sunny, as if the sky itself were conspiring for the celebration. The party was an intimate event, not the grand reception society would expect from a man like Marcos Silveira, but a gathering of hearts that had witnessed the family's journey. Carmen was radiant, circulating with a tray of sweets and a smile she hadn't worn in years. Helena remained discreetly in the background, her eyes shining with pride and affection, like an artist contemplating her masterpiece. But the center of it all was Marcos. Far from the tycoon in a suit and tie, he was sitting on the living room floor with a smear of cake frosting on his cheek, helping Pedro and Paulo's clumsy little hands tear the wrapping paper. He looked around, his sons laughing, the sun streaming through the window, the sound of happy conversation in the background. And for the first time in a year, he felt a genuine peace, a sense that everything was, finally, exactly as it should be. Isabella's memory was not a shadow, but the soft light that illuminated the happiness of that moment. At the height of the party, after they sang Happy Birthday, the twins were sitting in the middle of the room, surrounded by new toys and colorful paper. Marcos was kneeling a few feet away, an encouraging smile on his face. Suddenly, Paulo, the more restless of the two, fixed his gaze on a shiny red ball that had rolled near his father's feet. He looked at the ball, then at Marcos's face, as if measuring the distance. An expectant silence began to fall over the few guests. With fierce concentration, the little one propped himself up on a poof, wobbled for a moment, and to everyone's astonishment stood up. His little legs trembled with the effort, but he stood erect, a little hero conquering gravity. Carmen brought a hand to her mouth, suppressing a cry of emotion. Helena held her breath. Then, with his eyes fixed on his goal, his father, Paulo let go of his support, and he took 1, 2, 3 wobbly and glorious steps before falling, laughing, into the open arms of Marcos, who hugged him as if he had just crossed the ocean. The room exploded in a mixture of applause, laughter, and happy tears. Marcos hugged Paulo tightly, his heart beating erratically against his son's chest. He lifted him into the air, laughing as the boy giggled in response, the complicity between them now forged in an unforgettable moment. "That's it, my champion. You did it. You walked to Daddy," he repeated, his voice choked with emotion. It was a moment of pure, intoxicating joy, the reward for all the days of effort, for all the nights of doubt. While the small celebration focused on Paulo, the other twin, Pedro, watched everything from his corner. Always the quieter and more observant of the two, he absorbed the scene with remarkable intensity. He saw his brother's effort, the 3-step journey, and he saw the explosion of love that received him at the end. He saw his father's face, illuminated by a kind of pride and happiness he had never seen before. And in his little mind, a connection was formed. That man was not just a warm, safe presence. He was a destination, a safe harbor reached with effort and intention. While Marcos was still celebrating with Paulo in his arms, his gaze crossed the room and met Pedro's eyes. He smiled at his other son, a smile that said, "You are next, I am here for you too." Pedro, feeling included in that circle of love, furrowed his brow in concentration. He did not try to stand up. His challenge was different. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. The guests, noticing the attempt, fell silent once more. Then, with a clarity that shocked everyone present, Pedro pointed a chubby finger in Marcos's direction and uttered the word that would forever seal the healing of that family. Daddy. The word, syllabic, perfect, echoed in the room, laden with all the meaning of a year of waiting, a year of pain, and a year of transformation. If Paulo's steps were the conquest of the physical space that separated them, Pedro's word was the building of the emotional bridge that would unite them forever. Marcos felt the air leave his lungs, his heart overflowing in a way he did not think humanly possible. Marcos felt as if the entire world had stopped to listen to that single word. Daddy. He knelt in front of Pedro, his heart overflowing, and hugged him with infinite gentleness. Yes, my son, he whispered, his voice thick, kissing the top of the boy's head. I am Daddy, and I am here. He stayed there for a long moment, hugging his son, feeling the other crawling close, a small family nucleus forming in the middle of the room. Then, slowly, he raised his gaze. His eyes swept over the smiling faces of his friends and Carmen, but they did not stop there. They continued until they found, in a corner near the kitchen door, the quiet figure of Helena. She was watching him with silent tears streaming down her face, not trying to hide her emotion, but also not wanting to invade his moment. The instant their gazes met, a universe of gratitude and understanding passed between them. He no longer saw the maid, but the guardian angel who had guided him out of his own hell. And she saw not the millionaire boss, but a father who had finally found his way home. After that moment of silent communion, Marcos knew what he had to do. With the boys now playing at his feet, he stood up and asked for the attention of his few and dear guests. His voice, normally so firm and commanding in boardrooms, was trembling, laden with a humility no one would ever associate with him. My friends, thank you for being here today, celebrating the lives of my sons. He paused, his gaze once again seeking out Helena. But the truth is that this celebration, this joy, this family you see here today, none of it would exist if it weren't for one person. All eyes turned to Helena, who took a step back, surprised and uncomfortable with the sudden attention. Helena, Marcos said, his voice finally breaking, you came into this house to clean it. But what you did was heal it. You didn't just save my children's sleep, you saved my soul. You gave me back the ability to love. And for that, the word thank you is too small. It will never be enough to express what I feel. Helena felt her face burn, completely unprepared to be the focus of so much emotion. She shook her head slightly, an instinctive gesture of denial, as if wanting to deflect the tribute she didn't feel she deserved. In her heart, she had done nothing heroic. She had only looked at two suffering children and a father who was lost in his own pain, and did what her instinct and her humanity told her to do. She saw no dark secrets or complex strategies. She saw an open wound that needed care, and she offered the only medicine she knew, truth and affection. I did nothing, sir, she managed to whisper, her voice almost inaudible to the silent commotion that had taken over the guests. Carmen, in the background, dried her tears with a handkerchief, her heart bursting with pride for this woman who, with her simple wisdom, had performed the miracle no one else could. Marcos, seeing Helena's genuine humility, only became more certain of the step he was about to take. He crossed the room with a calm and determination that silenced any whispers. He stopped right in front of Helena, closing the physical and social distance that had always existed between them until there was no longer boss and employee, only two people united by a story of pain and redemption. I know. In that thank you is not enough, Helena, he repeated, his voice now firm, looking her in the eyes. That is why I no longer want your role in this house to be that of an employee. I want you to be family, officially and forever. He took a deep breath, preparing for the most important words he would say since he had declared his love to Isabella. My wife and I never got around to choosing godparents for our children. It was one of the many conversations that time stole from us. But I know, with every fiber of my being, that she would agree with my choice now. Helena Silva, in front of our friends and of God, I ask you, will you accept being Pedro and Paulo's godmother? Will you accept being the guardian of their happiness and their future alongside me? Marcos's question hung in the air, heavier and more significant than any business transaction he had ever proposed. For Helena, the world seemed to spin in slow motion. She looked at Marcos's serious and emotional face, then at the two boys playing on the floor, oblivious to the magnitude of the moment that would define their lives. Godmother, guardian, family. These were words that she, in her simple, hard-working life, had never dared to dream of associating with herself within that mansion. She had come seeking a salary, a roof, and now she was being offered a place of honor in the heart of the family she had helped to mend. A wave of emotion, as strong as the one she had seen in Marcos, overwhelmed her. The tears, which before were of compassion and joy for others, were now for herself, for the turn her life had taken. With her voice choked by the sobs she could no longer hold back, but with the firmness of a sacred promise, she answered, "Yes, yes, I accept. With all my soul, I accept." An emotional and spontaneous applause erupted in the room, breaking the solemn tension. Marcos, with a smile that finally reached his eyes, took a step forward and, in a gesture that broke the last barrier between them, gave Helena a chaste and grateful hug. It was a hug of alliance, of respect, of family. Then, as if drawn by a magnet, they both knelt on the floor side by side in front of their godchildren and sons. Marcos picked up Paulo and Helena with the naturalness of someone who had already done it 1,000 times in her heart, picked up Pedro. And there, on the living room rug, the final portrait of that journey was formed. Marcos and Helena facing each other with the boys in their laps, laughing and reaching their little hands out to one another over the arms of their parents. In that exact moment, the last shadow of Isabella as a memory of pain dissipated, and in its place, only her light remained, blessing the new and unusual family that her love in the end had created. Life after that birthday settled into a new and beautiful routine. Helena, at Marcos's insistent request, left the modest staff quarters and moved into a guest suite in the main wing of the house, an act that symbolized her transition from employee to family member. However, her essence remained the same. She never tried to take Isabella's place or assume the role of lady of the house. She remained the same, Helena, the serene presence, the wise counselor, the safe harbor. For Pedro and Paulo, she became Dinda Lena, a figure as fundamental as their father. Marcos was the strength, the adventure, the father who taught them to kick a ball and not be afraid of the dark. Helena was the comfort, the storyteller. Before bed, the one who took care of scraped knees with kisses and kind words. Together, without ever needing to discuss their roles, they formed a perfect parenting duo, offering the boys the balance of love and care that every child deserves, always under the watchful and loving gaze of Isabella's memory. The letters in the marquetry box continued to be a central part of that family's life. As the boys grew and went from being babies to curious children, their meaning deepened. On a rainy afternoon, when the twins were almost 3, Pedro, while playing in his mother's old room, now a serene and illuminated space of memory, pointed to the box on the dresser. "What is that, Daddy?" he asked, with the typical curiosity of his age. Marcos felt his heart warm. This was the moment Isabella had foreseen. He took his son onto his lap, sat in the armchair and opened the box. He took one of the letters addressed to Pedro and began to read it aloud. "My dear son," read Isabella's handwriting, "today I want to talk to you about kindness. Being strong is not about how loud you shout, but about how gently you treat others. Promise, Mommy, that you will always use your strength to help, never to hurt." And so, Isabella's wisdom continued to guide the upbringing of her sons, her voice echoing through the love of the father she had saved. Isabella's wisdom proved to be frighteningly accurate as time went on. One day, Paolo, who had inherited a strong temper and an unshakable stubbornness, had a tantrum because he couldn't assemble a toy block. He threw the piece far away, his face red with frustration. Instead of scolding him, Marcos hugged him calmly until the storm passed. Later, with the boy calmer in his lap, he went to the box and took a letter addressed to Paolo. "My dear and stubborn Paolo," Marcos read, his voice full of affection, "I feel within me that you will have the soul of a fighter. This strength is your greatest gift. But listen to Mommy. Use your stubbornness for good. Use it to defend a friend, to not give up on a dream, to fight for what is right. Stubbornness, my son, can be the armor of a hero or the prison of a fool. The choice will always be yours." Paolo listened attentively, and although he did not understand all the words, he felt the intention, the love, and the lesson seemed to settle in his little heart. Marcos's transformation, however, transcended the walls of the mansion and echoed in his professional world. The man, once known for his ruthless coldness in negotiations, began to operate from a new center of gravity: empathy. His employees and partners noticed the change. He became a better listener, a more human leader. The most significant change, however, was the creation of the Isabella Silvera Foundation, a charitable institution with the mission of supporting parents who, like him, found themselves lost after the loss of a spouse, offering psychological and financial support. He instituted extended paternity leave in his companies and more flexible working hours, becoming a pioneer in his sector. The empire he built to accumulate power and wealth now had a new purpose: to honor the memory of the woman who taught him to love and to become an agent of positive change in the world, proving that his greatest inheritance would not be money, but the legacy of a heart that was broken and rebuilt itself bigger and stronger. Helena, for her part, found in the Silvera mansion a destiny she could never have foreseen. She, who had imagined a life of solitary work, saw her heart filled with a love so vast and deep that she felt no need to seek another family. To Pedro and Paolo, she was simply a constant, a pillar of affection and wisdom. When they grew up and went to school, it was to Dindalena that they ran with their secrets, with their fears, and with the first crushes of childhood. One day, Pedro, at 7, brought home a drawing he made in art class. It was a portrait of his family. A tall, smiling man was Daddy. Next to him, 2 female figures. One in the sky with wings and a halo was Mommy Angel. The other on the ground, holding hands with him and his brother, was Dindalena. When Helena saw the drawing, her eyes filled with tears. There was the proof. She was not a substitute. She was an addition, a fundamental and beloved piece in the unique and wonderful puzzle that was their family. Grief in that house was never a taboo. On the contrary, Isabella's story was transformed by Marcos and Helena into a legend of love and sacrifice. The boy's birthday became a 2-part ritual. In the morning, the 3 would gather in Isabella's room, which now looked more like a chapel of good memories, with fresh flowers and photos of her smiling. Marcos would read one of her letters, and then each would tell a story or a feeling about her. Today at school, I helped a friend who fell, Mommy. I think you would be proud, Paolo would say, looking at a portrait of her. In the afternoon, the house would fill with friends and joy for the birthday party. With this tradition, Marcos ensured that his sons did not grow up with a hole in their hearts, but with a presence. Isabella was not the mother they lost. She was the mother angel who guided them, whose love was so powerful that it continued to teach and protect them, even from heaven. The years passed like the seasons, each bringing new colors and new forms of happiness to the Silvera mansion. At 12, Pedro and Paolo were no longer boys who needed to be held, but young men whose personalities were a living reflection of the teachings they had received. Pedro, with his gentle soul, was the peacemaker of the group, the loyal friend everyone sought for advice. Paolo, with his tireless energy, had become the captain of the school's soccer team, a natural leader who used his stubbornness to motivate the team and defend weaker classmates. One afternoon, Marcos watched them from his office window, playing ball with friends in the vast garden. He saw the honor in Pedro as he helped a fallen opponent, and saw the passion in Paolo as he celebrated a goal with the team. In every gesture, in every smile, he saw Isabella's hand, guiding them through him, and he felt a peace and pride so deep it seemed to fill every corner of his soul. That anguished man, lost in a labyrinth of pain, had given way to a fulfilled father. That same afternoon, Helena joined him on the balcony, bringing 2 cups of coffee, a silent ritual they had. Developed over the years, their relationship had transformed into a solid partnership, a deep friendship forged in the trenches of pain and cemented by unconditional love for the boys. There were no more formalities, only the complicity of 2 generals who had won a long and difficult war. They sat side by side, watching the boys run. A casual observer might mistake them for an old couple, but their bond was different, unique. It was an alliance of souls. "They are good boys, aren't they?" Marcos said, his voice low, full of admiration. "Just look at them, Helena." She smiled, a serene smile that contained a decade of memories. "They are the best of both of you," she replied. Marcos sighed, a sound of pure contentment. She would be so proud. Helena placed her hand on his for a moment and said, with unshakable certainty, "She is proud, Marcos. She never stopped being." The journey of the Silvera family became a silent lesson for all who knew them. They learned that healing did not mean erasing the pain of loss. Isabella's absence never completely disappeared. Instead, the family learned to live with it, transforming the void into a sacred space filled with gratitude and happy memories. Grief, which was once an anchor that sank Marcos into darkness, became a kind of compass, always pointing to the north of love and responsibility. The old housekeeper, Carmen, now enjoyed a quiet retirement but visited the mansion every week, bringing sweets for her boys. She was the original witness, the one who saw the rock bottom and the miracle of redemption, and to anyone who would listen, she would tell the story of how a woman with a good heart and a man who dared to listen to the voice of his pain managed to rewrite a destiny that seemed fated for tragedy. Isabella's room, once a sealed tomb of forbidden memories, had transformed into the true heart of the house. The door was always open, and the atmosphere was an invitation to peace. The children came and went, freely, flipping through photo albums, smelling the scent that still lingered softly in the air, connecting with the mother they never knew but loved deeply. On the dresser, the marquetry box that once held the map to the family's salvation was almost empty. Letter by letter, Isabella's wisdom had been absorbed, her lessons practiced, her love internalized. The last letter had been read long ago. Isabella's mission, her last act of love, orchestrated from beyond life, was accomplished. She no longer needed to give instructions. The family she had dreamed of so much now knew how to walk on its own feet, strong, united, and forever guided by the light of her sacrifice. And so, the story of the Silvera family unfolded, with each character finding their rightful place in the grand scheme of life. Marcos, the once tormented millionaire, became living proof that true wealth is not measured in figures, but in the capacity to love and be loved. He found peace not by fleeing from his suffering, but by diving into it and emerging a better man. Helena, the humble candidate for a domestic job, discovered that her greatest gift was not in her hard-working hands, but in her compassionate soul, capable of hearing what others' hearts screamed in silence. And the boys, Pedro and Paulo, grew up like strong, healthy trees, their roots nourished by the love of a father, the dedication of a godmother, and the wisdom of a mother whose love was strong enough to transcend death itself. They were, each in their own way, Isabella's final triumph. The mansion, which at the beginning was a palace of marble and silence, a monument to pain and isolation, transformed into a home in the purest sense of the word. A place of laughter, of conversations, of open doors and connected hearts. What caused such a radical transformation? It was not Marcos's fortune, which proved useless in buying peace. It was not the dozens of hired experts with their methods and techniques that failed miserably. The change came from something much simpler and at the same time infinitely more powerful. The change came from the courage of a woman who dared to see beyond the surface and the humility of a man who, at the bottom of his pit of despair, found the strength to accept that he was broken and needed help to find the pieces of himself. The story of that family teaches us, above all, to listen. It teaches that the incessant crying that the world judged to be a problem, a tantrum, a flaw, was in fact a language, the purest and most desperate language that exists, that of absence, of longing, of love that could not find a lap to rest on. The solution to the most deafening noise in that house was not in a new method or a new technique to silence it. It was in the silence of a father who finally stopped to listen, not with his ears, but with his soul. It was in the courage to recognize that his children did not cry because they were difficult. They cried because their father had forgotten how to speak their language, a language not made of words, but of presence, of touch, of a heart that opens to share the weight of its own wound. In the end, Isabella's love did not die in that hospital. It transformed, multiplied, and flourished in the most unexpected ways. It manifested in Helena's intuition, in Marcos's redemption, in Pedro's joy, and in Paulo's courage. The family they built, composed of a father who was reborn, a godmother who was the answer to a prayer, and two boys who were the promise of a bright future, was perhaps not the traditional family of picture frames. But it was something much stronger. It was a family forged in the fire of adversity, united not just by blood ties, but by the conscious daily choice to love each other, to support each other, and to honor their scars, not as marks of a tragedy, but as the map that guided them to the meeting of their best versions. If someone could take a final photograph of that family, years after the crying and the anguish, the image would be of a disarming simplicity. It would be the portrait of a late afternoon on the mansion's balcony. Marcos and Helena, sitting in comfortable chairs, sharing a complicit silence and a serene smile. On the lawn in front, Pedro and Paulo, now tall and strong young men, playing, laughing, arguing about some banality of teenage life. The golden light of the setting sun bathing everyone, the sound of laughter mixing with the buzzing of cicadas. There would be no drama, no tears, no revelations. There would only be peace, a peace hard won, and which, for that very reason, was the most valuable of all the treasures that house could contain. The proof that happiness is not the absence of problems, but the presence of love. Because in the end, the story of Marcos, Helena, Pedro, and Paulo is a reminder that pain, however overwhelming, does not have to be a final period. It can be just a comma in a long sentence, a pause that precedes a new chapter, rewritten with hope and new colors. It is the proof that a broken heart can beat again, that a silenced house can sing again, and that a family, even if born from the deepest tragedy, can flourish. And in that mansion, where the winter of the soul once reigned, love proved to be, as it always is, for those who dare to believe, an eternal and tireless spring.